Welcome. You are listening to the Food Podcast. The Food Podcast is brought to you by Clearview Federal Credit Union on the TribLIVE Podcast Network. Greater Pittsburgh Community Food Bank is celebrating Black History Month. Obviously, that's the month of February. And we're doing that by learning more about food insecurity and race, specifically in the Three Rivers region. So we know already that race has played a part in food access and food equity in our region and really all across the world. So today we're going to learn more about that history because that history is just so important and critical when it comes to actually addressing food security, addressing the needs of our neighbors, and then just being there to provide that food access and that support for so many families. So that discussion is coming up right after this commercial break on the Food Podcast. The Food Podcast is brought to you by Clearview Federal Credit Union on the TribLIVE Podcast Network.
When you bank Clearview Federal Credit Union, it's like having the best seats of the game, a parking spot right out front, more fries on your salad, or a drive through the tunnels with no traffic. Choosing Clearview gives you financial solutions for every need, a helping hand in the community, and honest, trusted financial advice from familiar faces in your neighborhood. At Clearview, we want you to enjoy a better life. Visit clearviewfcu.org, open a new checking account, and get up to $500.
It was amazing. It reminded me of the part where Jesus feeds the crowd of 5,000 with the fish. That saved our life.
Welcome back to the Food Podcast. The Food Podcast is brought to you by Clearview Federal Credit Union on the TribLIVE Podcast Network. I am so excited for our guest today. In fact, he is someone that I know personally. It's been a joy to work with him at the food bank, and he's actually our Vice President of Equity, People, and Culture here at the food bank. So I'm so excited to welcome Godfrey Bethia to the Food Podcast today. Thanks for being with us today, Godfrey.
Well, thanks for inviting me back again. I'm excited.
Thank you. You're a food podcast veteran now.
Yes.
So it's exciting. We had the pleasure of learning more about your position in itself a while back, but I know this position is with EDI, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. So now that we know a little bit about your position too, why do you think it's important for someone, a place like the food bank, to have a position like yours in-house on staff?
Yeah, great question. You need someone in the organization that has some accountability towards driving an equitable and inclusive culture. My position within the food bank, I can drive accountabilities and support throughout the organization in several ways. One, establishing a commitment to driving an equitable culture within the food bank, and then also externally in the community. I can roll out the strategy, get buy-in from leadership, and have the ability to make it happen. I could tie EDI into every aspect of the organization, from customer service. How do we represent and know our community? If it's finance, are we spending the dollars with the minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses? And if it's something like innovation, do we have diverse perspectives? And then finally, not only my position, but I'm able to keep the finger on the pulse of focusing on equity. So not only myself, but we have councils and work groups and individuals asking necessary questions. Did we get the feedback from others? Is this fair? Is this consistent for all? So having that type of accountability and ownership really goes a long way for the food bank.
Yeah, and it's so important to know about the communities we're serving so that we can serve them in the best way possible. And I know things have been so different. There's such a thick history when it comes to our different communities that we serve. So explain to me, from the lens of food access and food equality, do communities, including the Black community, have equal access to food in our region?
Well, the straight answer is no. It's really who has the power to drive and or the ability to drive access to resources to these communities. If you live in a wealthy neighborhood, for example, you tend to have more options of accessing high quality and healthy food options. You'll see things like grocery stores, cafes, markets, bakeries, restaurants. You'll have shopping outlets, banks, large chain operations, a lot of employment options for folks that live in those areas. You'll see bus lines, transportation options, maintained infrastructure, and roads. You'll see hospitals, medical centers, and treatment facilities. And tax dollars and resources are actually brought and maintained in the community. But there are historical policies and programs that limit Black neighborhoods from having such power. Historically, there was restrictive covenants, meaning you couldn't live in certain neighborhoods or certain communities. You had loan discrimination. You have segregated educational systems. If you live in a segregated neighborhood, or sometimes it's highly densely populated within the community, and you'll see things in those communities like convenience stores, corner stores, fast food chains. You'll see check cashing stores, dollar stores, limited opportunity, employment opportunities in those areas. You'll see group health carriers are limited within those communities. Bus lines are cut. Infrastructure is poorly maintained. And in this high dense population, resources actually tend to be pulled out of that community rather than being driven into it. And if this is not your experience of understanding or living in this type of community, then you have an unaware and unknown privilege. And the privilege is having a certain life advantages or accesses to higher quality resources like the food, healthcare, housing, employment, education, childcare. And resources are generally attainable within and are within reach. But if you live in these areas in marginalized communities, these resources are decision points for individuals. Individuals have to make decisions whether they want to work while they're sick and ill and receive benefits, which a lot of times it's hard to work while you're sick and have ailments, or do you receive medical benefits and not put your body in that predicament. You can rely on limited transportation to access healthy food, or save what you can for another time so you can have money for personal or family needs. These are decisions that individuals in these communities have to make. And if you're not aware of that, those types of experiences are lost.
And Godfrey, I know the why. Why are these communities experience this? There's so much to it, and we're going to get into some of that today. But I know whenever we learn about this community, and we see the different things that people are experiencing, we know the history. It's so important to us, especially from a food perspective, because we fight for something that we call food justice. And I know that might be a new term to some people. So can you explain to me what we mean when we say food justice, what that term and phrase means?
Yeah, well, basically what food justice is, to its simplest form, is ensuring the where, the what, and how food is either grown, transported, accessed, and eaten is distributed fairly. And in some communities, that just doesn't exist. That fair system. The U.S. has the highest rates of hunger and food insecurity among the most developed nations. The impact of food insecurity is disproportionate impacts and hits harder on poor households, single parents, communities of color, and African Americans are 3 times more likely to experience food insecurity than their white counterparts. For food insecurity, African Americans' likelihood of food insecurity is 26.1%. For Hispanics and Latinos, it's 23.7%. And for white Americans, it's 10.6% of likelihood of facing food insecurity. Now, that is when you add on different dynamics of that. If you're a single parent, like a single father, food insecurity rises up to 23.1%. And for a single mother, it's actually less, but it's actually 20.9%. But when you add on the race and ethnicity to that dynamic, if you're Black and a single mother with food insecurity, that rises from 26.1% to 33.3%. Latino single mothers it rises up to 34.3%, and indigenous single mothers is up to 37.1%.
Wow. Godfrey, personally, when you see those numbers, what's your gut reaction? How does that hit you when you read it?
It just underlines that there is institutional issues that need to be addressed. We need to know how to address it. We need to be able to identify the root cause, and not just, it's not just providing food. It's understanding what is the root cause of this food insecurity.
Yeah, because you look at those numbers and it's just so clear, like, wow, there's a problem that we need to solve. We need to be able to balance these scales. But obviously, there's some major problems as a society that we have right now, which has caused a need for food justice. So, in today's society, too, we saw those statistics, but what are some of the big problems that we're seeing as a society that are causing this, that are creating a need for food justice right now?
Yeah, it's really that an unaware experience of those that are living in these circumstances, and there tends to be two dynamics that happen within that. There's marginalization, and that is it's really stereotyping a group of people without knowing the circumstances of which they deal with, while not seeing your own privilege and the privilege you had in your own life. And then the other dynamic there is disenfranchisement. And really, that is just turning a blind eye to those groups without helping to drive resources or solutions to those in need.
So when we learn more about things like that our society does, how does that play into the big picture too, the big problem, things like structural racism in today's world?
Yeah, all that we talked about was power, privilege, marginalization, disenfranchisement, which leads to what perpetuates structural racism, and really in understanding food insecurity. Really, all of those keeps the cycle going. So when you talk about structural racism, it's housing segregation, which created concentrated poverty. So in those areas, you'll find food deserts, transit deserts, low tax base for schools, parks, and other public entities. You have higher exposure to predatory lenders. You have environmental racism, since families are expected to or are susceptible to environmental toxins, lead paint, and higher exposure to fast food advertising in those areas. There's a racial divide, which leads to less assets to fight poverty, being 18% less wealthy than white counterparts living near the poverty line, and less assets for future opportunities, including retirement and education, and higher probability of facing or failing and falling into deeper poverty. And employment discrimination, job segregation, wage divides, disproportionately working in 10% lower paying occupations. You have lower pay, lower benefits. So the higher unemployment rates, lower promotion rates. And here's one that's really key is over policing. People don't think that plays a role into food security, but if you think about it, it does result in 10%. Being 10% more likely to be incarcerated in certain states, parents losing jobs from incarceration, families going into debt, and having to pay for bail bonds, court fees, over ticketing, loss of income while incarcerated. And a lot of this conversation started with George Floyd incident, and loss of life in cases of police killings. And then you just have discrimination in healthcare, racially biased medical care, and higher probability of going to underfunded healthcare facilities. And these barriers maintain higher food insecurity levels among communities of color. And those results tend to lead to those situations that many of the individuals in these communities deal with.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to hear you talk about that too, Godfrey, because one of the things that we do is we look for, okay, what is causing food insecurity, right? I mean, it's not something that happens overnight. There's always these root causes, which we try to tackle. And so many of them are things that you talked about: housing, employment, transportation issues, healthcare. All of those things are major, major buckets and major root causes for food insecurity. So we're seeing that too. And I know that whenever we talk about structural racism, which, as we know, is connected to a lot of the causes of food insecurity, that also impacts culture too. So explain to me, from a food perspective, how that impacts things like policies or programs when it comes to food. I mean, there's a cultural ripple effect there, isn't there?
Absolutely, there's a ripple effect. It really is bought into how people respond or are trying to help or show up in these situations. They show up in many forms, and they show up when you're talking about policies around food programs, how food is administered. There are three dynamics there that kind of take place that you'll see these characteristics come through, and they're really unhealthy characteristics. There's the first one is individualism. It's really looking from the outside and drawing a difference between you versus the individual with that lived experience. There's a paternalistic characteristic where you're approaching it from, I know what's best for you, so we're going to provide what we think you need in order to reduce your food insecurity. And then there's another dynamics. It's neoliberalism, but really what that word is, it's replacing what you don't have with what we think is best for you. And in those dynamics, what you'll hear, and when you hear this is where you'll know this is taking place. You'll hear things as, if they only know what was better for them, they will do better. They make the choices they live in. Communities can't take care of themselves, so we need to come in and save them. We fail to listen to those individuals. We came up with our own solutions. We build a solution, and they will come. They'll be better off if they pick themselves by the bootstraps. And really what that is an old 19th century saying that if they will get out and do the work, things will be better for themselves. You also hear things like, if they need food, let's deliver the food to them. Just give them the food. And then you also hear, we decide what's healthy, what healthy food looks like. And a lot of that really doesn't take in consideration those characteristics, take in consideration those individuals on their experience in tackling what the root cause is. And we talked about that in that structural racism aspect: the power, the privilege, the disenfranchisement, and the marginalization.
What I like too, Godfrey, is, representation matters. Hearing from our communities matter. Listening to our communities matter. I mean, these are big things, that line of communication. And honestly, what I love about the food bank is that the food bank doesn't shy away from these issues. Knowing what we know, what is the food bank doing to fight food insecurity and to honestly fight for food equity when we're seeing these issues and we can clearly see that there's a problem? I mean, what does the food bank do to step in and address some of these things?
Well, for one, it's Black History Month, right? So, taking some time to acknowledge and understand the history of where we are today, to understand why it is the way it is. We tend to look at today in its own concept without understanding, the historical aspects of where we landed, why things are why they are today. The history is difficult. It's not comfortable. It's not meant to make people feel uncomfortable. It's meant to make people understand how the past informs the present. So really what we do is try to drive a lot of educational opportunities for staff to understand the history, understand, the root cause to a lot of food insecurity. And then intercultural competence is essential for fostering positive interactions and creating non-judgmental, inclusive environments. So we tend to do a lot of that and trying to build up our cultural competence. And then instead of determining and reacting to dominant cultural nutritional guidelines of what is good and what is bad, we need to not ignore the cultural significance of certain foods, or incinerating some foods are bad based on its cultural racial associations. So learning the culture is very key of our community. Keep the needs of the people in the center of what we do. Use an equity-centered approach to make it easier for communities to receive support and increase support for and accountability of community partners. And then finally, I think the one area that we really have a way is create a way for the community to participate in our program designs, implementation, and evaluation. Just like you said, as far as the representation is key, to hear those voices with those lived experiences is going to be key for us to be able to, tackle the solutions that are needed for the community.
Godfrey, I'm so happy that you were able to talk with us about this. I think I know for the person at home, that's not working at the food bank, that's interested in, what do you think the first step as a society is? Is it listening and learning? Is that kind of the first step for, finding a solution and creating this equitable environment in society?
Yes, it's self-education. It's really learning, understanding your own identity, your own upbringing experiences, and then learning other experiences, and identify what those differences are, and then lean into what those differences are. Ask questions from those that have that lived experiences. Take the opportunity to read periodicals, or get as much information you can to learn about those individuals with those lived experiences. Identify those differences and identify where you have the opportunity to give them the voice to share that information in forms such as this, or where policies are being talked about, where programs are being developed. Give them the opportunity to provide their voice in those situations.
Yeah, it's awesome. I say one of the best things you can do is raise awareness, share platforms like this with your friends and your family on your social media platform, or if you're listening or watching to this food podcast, sharing it is a great way that you can advocate and help educate other people too. If it comes into their news feed, there you go. It's right there. It's creating that way that people can get eyes on it and learn more and make a difference. So Godfrey, I am so overjoyed that you were able to join us today and create this educational platform so that people can learn more. And honestly, letting me ask you so many questions about this so that we can learn specifically from the lens of food and the things going on behind the scenes at the food bank. We really put so much thought into the work that we do. And it's been such a joy to have you.
Absolutely. Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
All right. It's about that time that we need to take a commercial break now, actually. So if you are listening or watching, this is the Food Podcast. The Food Podcast is brought to you by Clearview Federal Credit Union on the TribLIVE Podcast Network.
When you can't get around and it's hard to walk, it just makes you feel like you're worthless. And this just helps me feel like I'm worth something.
When you bank with Clearview Federal Credit Union, it's like having the best seats of the game. A parking spot right out front, more fries on your salad, or a drive through the tunnels with no traffic. Choosing Clearview gives you financial solutions for every need, a helping hand in the community, and honest, trusted financial advice from familiar faces in your neighborhood. At Clearview, we want you to enjoy a better life. Visit clearviewfcu.org, open a new checking account, and get up to $500.
Welcome back to the Food Podcast. The Food Podcast is brought to you by Clearview Federal Credit Union on the TribLIVE Podcast Network. Such a joy to have Godfrey on our team and as a tool to help us learn more about the issues facing the Three Rivers region. It's such a big region. We cover 11 counties. So when we say Greater Pittsburgh, we really mean Greater Pittsburgh. There are so many people out there, and learning about our communities is the best way that we can learn to serve them in the best way too when it comes to food equity and food equality. We do have some more things coming up. So, in future episodes of the Food Podcast, something really interesting, in fact, the University of Pittsburgh Joseph M. Katz Graduate School of Business, quite a mouthful, they have decided that they're going to partner with Greater Pittsburgh Community Food Bank for the second annual Super Analytics Challenge. Basically, that means there's a lot of grad students that are learning about an issue in our area. They learn as much as they can, and then they kind of come up with innovative ways to help with that issue. Last year, they covered homelessness, and now they're tackling food insecurity. So it's a really great partnership and a great way that we can learn more, get some more information, and have some fresh eyes on these issues, innovative ways that we can serve our community. So we're very excited about that, and we will get to hear from the winners of that challenge about what they learned about food insecurity in our area, and then kind of what they think a possible solution is, ways that we can chip away at that issue. But we'll talk about that in next week's episode. For now, I just want to thank you for listening or watching the Food Podcast. The Food Podcast is brought to you by Clearview Federal Credit Union on the TribLIVE Podcast Network.